that most people will benefit from not eating for an hour or two after they wake up and not eating for 2 to 3 hours before they go to sleep.
So there's two bits of the brain where you actually grow new brain cells over your life. To have a clinical depressive disorder, a clinical anxiety disorder, or even a bipolar disorder.
My mom was a young person. She was 58 at the time. She was vibrant. She had blonde hair. Not that blonde is necessarily a sign of or a marker of youth, but you know, my mom was as spirited as you know, a New Yorker is. My mom is a born and bred New Yorker, fast talking, fast walking, ran a business, raised 3 children. And it was at the age of 58 that my mom started to show the earliest signs of dementia. She also had a change to her gait, which is the way that she walked. And this is something that became very apparent to me and my brothers. But because I had no prior family history of any kind of dementia, we were at a complete loss as to what might be going on with my mom. I mean, I didn't even know it at the time. But, you know, movement is something that is by and large dictated by your brain health. I thought that it was a muscular thing, or that my mom just needed to get to the gym and stretch more. But lo and behold, the journey to try to figure out what it was that my mom had led to me visiting some of the top neurology departments in the United States. I remember distinctly going to the U.S. News and World Report's annual listing of neurology departments and making check boxes to try to figure out which department we would go to first in search of answers. And the journey culminated with my visit to the Cleveland Clinic with my mom. And, you know, the Cleveland Clinic, what I heard about it back then was that they were known for really assembling a team to help diagnose complex medical problems. And it was there that my mom was diagnosed for the first time with a neurodegenerative disease. She was prescribed drugs for both Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, even though her symptoms didn't fit neatly into either diagnosis. And that was probably one of the most traumatic experiences of my entire life. I was not really told much about my mom's condition in the doctor's office. He ran a bunch of strange tests that you know, are very kind of surreal and almost absurd to the lay person's eye, to the untrained eye. And he essentially prescribed these biochemical band-aids without telling me much about what they do, or recommending any kind of dietary or lifestyle intervention that might help my mom. So when I got back to the hotel that weekend and I started to Google the drugs that my mom was prescribed, it dawned on me that my mom was prescribed drugs for both of these diseases, and that they have no disease-modifying effect, and that they are highly limited in their efficacy to boot. So I was traumatized. I had a panic attack, and I basically decided from that point on that I would learn to the best of my ability from the leading experts in the field what would lead a person to develop dementia. Because I had no prior family history of the disease, I had a hunch that there had to be something in the environment that was contributing to what I was seeing in my mom. And I started looking into PubMed, into all the primary literature, to really look at the associations and the mechanisms at play that would lead a person living in the Western world to develop this disease. And then I began reaching out to scientists and researchers around the world, and that culminated in my writing Genius Foods, which basically is a 7-year journey, all of the insights that I've learned from the top researchers in the world, self-experimentation, population studies, clinical trials, animal studies. It's really what I think to be a synthesis of the best available evidence in terms of how we might live to protect our brains and also enhance them.
Great. And you know, one of the things I like about the book is this is often very dry scientific material. And you know, sometimes it takes a degree in neurology and training in neurology to even make sense of these things. But what I think you've been able to do for the lay reader, which is obviously who this book is for, is to distill these really complex things and put them into actionable items. through the years, I've become good friends with Dr. Dale Bredesen, who I think you've met, who wrote The End of Alzheimer's. And one of the things that Dale has taught me, actually, Dale's wife taught him. Dale was a bench researcher, and an excellent bench researcher, particularly on how the ApoE4 gene works and behaves. But his wife, who is a practicing physician, they love to tell the story. She finally one day said, all this bench research is great, but, why don't you put this into action with real human beings rather than with a bunch of mice? And he says, well, that's an interesting concept. So, taking this very complex stuff and dialing it down to actionable items, I think, is really where your book is going to have a really profound impact. And congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, as a young person speaking for the millennial demographic, I know that dementia is not something that's on the minds of most millennials. They're like, when I talk about my passion for dementia prevention, they say, come back to me in 40 years. But the reality is that Alzheimer's disease begins in the brain 30 to 40 years, if not more, before the first symptom. I mean, Parkinson's disease, which is the second most common neurodegenerative disease, by the time you show your first symptom, 50% of the dopaminergic neurons, the neurons involved in movement in the part of the brain, the substantia nigra, affected by Parkinson's disease, are already dead. So Genius Foods to me really was about Trojan horsing the best information when it comes to preventing Alzheimer's disease, which is, now the conversation surrounding prevention in Alzheimer's disease finally is in the zeitgeist. But, when I began writing it 4 years ago, nobody was talking about Alzheimer's as a potentially preventable disease. So it's the best synthesis of Alzheimer's prevention and everything that we know about the prevention of other neurological conditions. But it's packaged in the language of performance, because what I learned over the course of my research is that the same things that you can do that will shield your brain against the modern world and protect it and help facilitate healthy cognitive aging also make your brain work better in the here and now, so that you can have more energy, you can have more mental resilience, cognitive clarity, the same factors that act as a neuroprotective, as offering neuroprotection, also improve executive function, which some researchers believe is more important to a person's success than IQ. So it offers a lot for the person just trying to improve the way that their brain works day to day. But again, it's a Trojan horse, because, people that aren't necessarily my secret goal, Dr. Gundry, is that people that don't know that they're interested in dementia prevention are going to pick it up and inadvertently, potentially prevent their own dementia. So that's really my passion. And, I've seen the monster that is dementia. I see it every single day. And so, the fact that my mother has a form of dementia has kept me very honest in terms of the way that I communicate science, the degree of hope that I offer for people that are already affected by cognitive decline. And it makes me want to really communicate the science with the level of optimism that I feel, while also doing it responsibly, because I think that's the most important thing. We live in a time where, information is ubiquitous. It's coming at us 24/7, but at the same time, it's become ever more difficult to know what's true and know what's hype. And
you mean fake news exists? Come on.
It does exist. It does exist. Some of our most trusted media outlets are more driven by driving clicks to their websites than actually making people healthier. And this is illustrated by headlines that you often see about health. One day you'll see a headline that fat is back, and the next day you'll see a headline that high-fat diets are damaging to the brain. The reality is that fat is our brain's friend. Our brain is constructed of fats, and the kinds of fats that you eat moment to moment weigh in very heavily on the performance of your brain, as well as its predilection for disease. So these nuances are often lost in the media, and in Genius Foods, I really try to separate fat from fiction, so to speak.
Cute, love it. Yeah, one of the things I've had the pleasure of presenting at some of the neuro conferences at Stanford and Harvard, MIT over the past year, And some of the, just speaking of fat in the brain, I think most people should realize that our brain is 60 to 70% fat. And half of the fat in our brain is a component of fish oil, which is called DHA. And interestingly enough, the other half is actually arachidonic acid, which gets the evil omega-6. I've always told people if arachidonic acid was that evil, then why is your brain, half arachidonic acid? And there's now been some beautiful studies of MRIs of people's brains as they age. And people who have the highest omega-3 index, which is basically looking at EPA and DHA attached to red blood cells over a 2-month period, the people with the highest index of omega-3s have the biggest brains and the biggest areas of memory, the hippocampus. And the people who have the lowest levels of omega-3 have the most shrunken brains and the smallest areas of hippocampus memory. And that's actually, number one, scary stuff, but it's also, as you point out, empowering, because a simple change in diet, and maybe you can elaborate on that, can just give your brain the fat it needs to actually work.
Absolutely. Researchers speculate that it's access to DHA fat from fish, from, properly raised, pasture-raised animals that catalyze the growth of our brains. So that's why today in the modern world, the consumption of foods that are rich in these fats are associated with bigger, more robust brains. And one of the mechanisms behind that is that DHA fat promotes the upregulation of a powerful growth hormone that's been called miracle grow for the brain. Its proper name is BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And you can actually sprinkle BDNF on neurons in a petri dish, and you actually will see them sprout dendrites, which are thought to be the physical correlates of memories, in that petri dish, like a chia pet. You just sprinkle BDNF on those neurons, and that's actually, BDNF is increased when we consume more DHA fat. Simultaneously, inflammation is a well-known brain drain when it comes to BDNF. And the other component of fish oil, EPA, is a really powerful anti-inflammatory. So you've got those two fatty acids working in tandem to help promote healthy brain volume. You've got DHA fat and you've got EPA fat. And these foods are, or these fats rather, are omnipresent in fatty fish, the fat of wild salmon, sardines, which I love, mackerel, herring. These are all powerful brain foods. And in fact, genius foods, as we highlight them in the book. And also, they're found in appreciable amounts in the fat of grass-fed beef, much smaller, much to a much lesser degree than in fatty fish, but they're present, as well as in omega-3 enriched or pasture-raised eggs. Many people, right. The conversation around omega-3 fats sometimes includes plant-based forms, like from flaxseed oil, and chia seeds. I know you're not a fan of chia seeds, but these are actually not very efficiently converted to their usable forms in the human body. So I like to make the recommendation that people should really opt for preformed EPA and DHA from fish oil. If you're a vegan or vegetarian, algal oil is helpful, or krill oil. Very beneficial.
Yeah, you're right. I take care of a lot of vegans and vegetarians in my practice who have made the mistake with good intention of using flaxseed oil as a source of omega-3s without realizing that these are short-chain omega-3s. And our enzyme system to build short-chain omega-3s into long-chain omega-3s is very poor. A fish, on the other hand, is superb at doing this. And I see all of my vegans have really nice levels of short-chain omega-3s, but they have absolutely no DHA and EPA. And it's completely now replaceable with algae-based DHA. And there's no reason not to do that. You're correct. A number of my vegans, and certainly my vegetarians, will take krill oil thinking that, well, that's a harmless sort of plankton. But one of the important things about krill oil, and I have a lot of patients who try to use krill oil, there's not much DHA in one of those capsules of krill oil. And I'll have people say, oh, I take krill oil and it's much better than fish oil. And when we actually measure the DHA in krill oil eaters or swallowers, they just don't get enough. So you got to take a lot of krill oil.
Yeah, yeah. And also EPA, which is, to a much less appreciable degree in krill oil. And finally, the trials, the actual science, it's much more limited when it comes to krill oil when compared to fish oil. There's a bounty of research being done on fish oil, and that degree of research does not exist for krill oil. So I think, if cost is an issue, which I know for most people it is, fish oil is really the best way to go.
Yeah, and most commercial fish oil now is molecularly distilled, so you really don't have to worry about mercury or other toxins in most of the good quality fish oil out there. And even Costco sells a couple of good fish oil products. They have a couple bad ones too, but that's a whole nother story. So all right, we're going to build our brain with fish oil, with DHA and EPA. What are some other usable steps? And let me before you say that, obviously millennials, when I was a baby boomer, we knew we were going to live forever and never suffer anything that happened to our parents. And, our parents were really stupid. And then we became our parents. And it's nice to see actually millennials are the current new baby boomers. Sorry about that, but you are. And one of the things that's important to realize is that when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, there was really very, very limited dementia. We knew of, one old person who wasn't very sharp anymore, but for the most part, it did not exist. There were not nursing homes, spanning blocks with full-time caregivers of people. They just did not exist. And we now, as you are well aware of, have this epidemic of dementia. And we've seen it really in two generations. Really, actually, my generation was the first, and our parents was the first generation that this has happened to. And I think in your world travels, you've, I'm sure, run into societies where dementia is an incredibly tiny, tiny portion of late adulthood. Can you explain that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there have been studies done on Japanese nationals. People that live in Japan have typically low rates of Alzheimer's disease. There's a very low risk. But what happens when those Japanese nationals move to the United States, they have rates that mimic the incidence that you see in your average American. So it seems that there's something about the Western diet and lifestyle that is interacting with our genes in a harmful way when it comes to our brain health. You could also take a look at the Yoruba people in Ibadan, Nigeria, where the ApoE4 allele is very common. It's just as common there as it is here, and yet it has little to no association with Alzheimer's disease. So what that suggests is that the increased risk that we see in carriers of the ApoE4 allele, which by the way make up 25% of the population, so 1 in 4 viewers watching this are going to carry that allele, seems to be more an interaction between that gene and the Western way of life, the Western dietary pattern, that really seems to put a person at increased risk for this disease. The ApoE4 allele might be the canary in the coal mine for the Western way of life. And what that suggests is that if you have this allele, which puts you at anywhere between 2 and 14-fold increased risk for developing Alzheimer's disease in the United States, you could just move to Ibadan, Nigeria, and see that risk completely abolished. So to me, that is a really strong indicator that the soaring rates of Alzheimer's disease that we're seeing today, which by the way numbers are expected to triple by the year 2050, really is the function of a diet that's become saturated in refined processed carbohydrates, unhealthy industrial grain and seed oils, a sedentary lifestyle, chronic stress. I mean, these are all factors that play a role in positive or negative brain health. So, for people out there that are concerned about the ApoE4 allele, and actually that's one of the reasons why I discovered your work many years ago, is because you talk a lot about the ApoE4 allele, which I'm very passionate about the nutrigenomics surrounding this allele, because many people carry it, and it is the most well-defined Alzheimer's risk gene. So I think it's fascinating at the very least. But on the other hand, looking at the associations that really seem to interact with it and put a person at higher risk is really important in terms of steering a population away from Alzheimer's disease, which is a horrific disease for which there is no meaningful treatment. So
yeah, that's right. It's interesting. I have a number of people with the ApoE4 gene now in their mid-90s who are perfectly bright. They drive to see me, they remember my name, and most importantly, they know their way home, which becomes very critical as you get older. And one of them in particular has always struck me. She's a black woman who grew up in North Carolina, and I met her in her late 80s, and she was bright, and she carried the ApoE4. And I said, tell me, I said, man, this is impressive. You're smart and all this. What do you eat? And she said, well, it's really interesting. I came out of the box wanting to eat greens, and I could not eat enough greens. And I really wasn't very interested in meats and things like that. And all I wanted was big plates of collard greens and all these greens. And I said, it's fascinating. I said, you didn't know it, but you chose the right diet for your gene coming out of the box. And you're right, the Nigerian studies are fascinating because they do carry a very high percentage of the ApoE4. And there have been age-matched controls with blacks in Indianapolis, and I'm sure you're aware of. And in fact, the Nigerians, despite carrying the ApoE4, they don't get Alzheimer's disease, whereas their age-matched control blacks in Indianapolis do. And it's clear that this is an environmental food-based problem. And so let's get back to, okay, so we've got fish oil everybody's getting. What other things are you going to have, particularly millennials do, so that, they're not drooling in their oatmeal when they're 60 years old?
Yeah, so in Genius Foods, I really take strides to make all of the recommendations actionable. So one of the top things that people can do every single day is eat a huge fatty salad. People kind of laugh at me on Instagram because I tag my salads with hashtag huge fatty salad. But it's really important. Research out of Rush University shows that people who eat a large bowl every single day of dark leafy greens have brains that look on scans 11 years younger. And when I say a fatty salad, I don't mean throwing cheese and tortilla strips and ranch dressing on top of that salad.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah, sorry to break it to you, but no, I'm a huge fan of extra virgin olive oil. There's no better vehicle for extra virgin olive oil than a salad. I'll consume kale, which is a powerful source of magnesium and soluble fiber, which feeds the gut bacteria. Spinach, which is a top source of magnesium and folate, which the brain needs to create energy. And arugula, which is a top source of dietary nitrate, which is really good for the healthy functioning of all of your blood vessels. And I'll douse it with extra virgin olive oil, 1 or 2 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil. And I eat that every single day, along with some, I'll throw some apple cider vinegar in there, maybe some lean protein, or not so lean protein, an egg perhaps. And that's a really good way, eating a large daily salad every single day. A lot of people think about salads in terms of, weight loss and satiety and things like that, but it's a really powerful way of checking off so many of your nutritional boxes. You're getting chlorophyll, which is rich in magnesium, you're getting dietary fiber, you're getting that extra virgin olive oil, which recent studies have shown in animal models that of all the fat types, extra virgin olive oil really seems to promote longevity. When looking at mice, which, it's easy to do these studies because mice only live about 2 years. So in terms of the oil that you want to really have in your diet for liberal consumption, and I know you agree with this, is really extra virgin olive oil. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of physical exercise. Physical exercise is really one of those things. Genius Foods focuses on the foods that you can eat that are going to improve the way that your brain works, but there is also a very significant lifestyle component to the book. And I talk about the kinds of exercise that you can do to really optimize brain function, as well as a new type of exercise that I highlight in the book, and that is thermal exercise. So recent research, very new research out of Finland, has shown that people that use sauna therapy 4 to 7 times per week have a remarkable risk reduction for developing dementia, about 65%. And this is very striking news because, in Finland, sauna use is sort of like taking a shower. It's so common in Finland because Finland is the sauna capital of the world. On average, there's 1 sauna per household. If you were to do that same study in the United States, I would say, well, people that have access to saunas usually have expensive gym memberships and things like that, right? This is why I think it's so important to understand how science is done. Because, taking this research done out of Finland really tells us that, there might be something to that link. And actually, when we look at what heat therapy does for the brain, it's pretty powerful. Essentially, heat exposure activates proteins in your body called heat shock proteins that act like little scaffoldings. Like you see scaffolding on the side of a building, they act like scaffolding for your proteins to prevent them from misfolding. Now, this is really important because when you take diseases like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease, these diseases are known as proteopathies. So basically, they're related to misfolding of proteins in the brain. Amyloid beta in Alzheimer's disease and alpha-synuclein in Parkinson's disease. So essentially, by doing physical exercise, you activate these same proteins. By sitting in a sauna, you're activating these same proteins. They act like scaffolding to prevent those proteins from becoming misfolded, which would then allow them to clump up potentially and form the plaques that characterize these diseases. So,
yeah, it's fascinating. I mentioned in my first book that actually I got interested in heat shock protein because it was a way of preventing cardiac cells, heart cells, from dying during occlusion during a heart attack. And we could do heat shock conditioning to prevent this from happening. And so in my first book, I recommended that during the summer, everybody needs to come to Palm Springs. And in fact, our tourist population in the summer is mostly Northern Europeans who actually come here, for the 100 and 110 and 115 degree heat. And they're laying out by the pool in a continuous sauna. And we always say, boy, what a bunch of idiots. Well, they're not a bunch of idiots. They're actually getting heat therapy. Yeah.
It's very important. Our bodies were honed in the hot East African sun. And
Absolutely.
so, and they know that heat can kill you. But at the same time, we're hardwired with these little genetic apps that kick in when we are under the threat of heat stress. And, too much heat will kill you, obviously, the same way that too much exercise could kill you. Drinking too much water can kill you. But there seems to be this narrow range where, sitting in a sauna, engaging in high-intensity exercise really seems to bring about very positive biochemical changes, which leads to enhanced cellular resilience. And this benefits the way that your brain works, as well as helps protect it against disease in the long term.
Okay, so we're going to take some fish oil. We're going to pour olive oil on everything. And as you know, my favorite saying is the only purpose of food is to get olive oil into your mouth. We're going to do some saunas, or we're going to do some high-intensity exercise. Give me one last thing that we shouldn't do that we're currently doing to really help our brains.
So for the last tip, I would say, there's no need to eat constantly throughout the day. There's now a lot of buzz surrounding intermittent fasting and various fasting protocols. We didn't always have food around. We weren't always able to summon our food with a few swipes on our smartphone. There weren't supermarkets on every corner. There weren't corners for the vast majority of our evolution. Fruit was available seasonally. We had to really work hard for our food. In fact, we had to chase our food for the vast, vast, vast majority of our evolution. So today, the balance between being in a fed and fasted state has been lost. We are chronically in the fed state. The lever is jammed with us constantly eating from sun up to sundown. So one of the recommendations in my book that I make is, rather than get hung up over the details of how many hours you're fasting, is that most people will benefit from not eating for an hour or two after they wake up and not eating for 2 to 3 hours before they go to sleep. So it really simplifies the notion of intermittent fasting, gets the numbers out of the way, and it basically just says, when you're waking up, you have a hormonal milieu, a hormonal environment in your body that wants to burn fat, and your brain loves to burn fat. I mean, certainly burning fat makes us look better in bathing suits come beach season, but the brain loves to partake in that party because when your brain is running off fat as a fuel source, it's a very clean burning fuel. And when we wake up in the morning, cortisol is the body's chief catabolic hormone. It basically is elevated. It's the highest that it's going to be throughout the day, generally speaking. And it wants to liberate stored fats, stored sugars, stored amino acids, all for use as fuel. And too often we thwart the opportunity that our brain has to use fat for fuel because we eat first thing in the morning. And especially in the modern world, we're eating carb-rich foods. That's not good because, cortisol is the body's chief catabolic hormone. It wants to break things down. And carbs cause insulin to become elevated, which is the body's chief anabolic or building up and growing hormone. It's the body's chief growth hormone. So you don't want to have those two hormones elevated simultaneously. From an evolutionary standpoint, it makes no sense. Your body gets totally confused. So when cortisol is elevated in the morning, you don't want to eat, or if you do eat, you want it to be mostly fat and protein. And you want to really stop, have your first bite maybe an hour or 2 or even 3 after waking up. That allows your body to really promote fat oxidation, which is really beneficial to the brain, it seems. And then before bed, first of all, your body wants to wind down at night. So, metabolism slows. But also, while you sleep, your brain undergoes many sort of custodial maintenance processes. Something called the glymphatic system becomes activated in the brain, which turns your brain sort of into a dishwasher where cerebrospinal fluid gets swooshed all throughout the brain, purging it of toxins that build up during the day. So this is a newly discovered system. We don't have all the answers. We probably don't even have a fraction of the answers, but it's believed that by having insulin elevated during this cleanup process that the brain undergoes every single night, it might interfere with that process. So I advise not eating for 2 to 3 hours before you go to sleep, or again, if you do, sticking to foods that don't stimulate insulin, so fattier foods, nuts perhaps, and foods that have a little bit of protein maybe, although protein does stimulate insulin, but to a much lesser degree than carbs, and really sort of, regaining that balance between being in a fasted and fed state. I think that's very important. Yeah. So that.
Great recommendation.
Thanks, Dr.
Yeah. Again, as a baby boomer, our parents would tell us that we couldn't go swimming for an hour after we had lunch because we would get horrible cramps and die and drown. And there was actually some truth to that wise tale that dovetails into what you just said, is that after we eat, we put a lot of our blood flow down into our intestines for the purpose of digestion. And it's actually shunted away from the brain. And the brain is by far the hungriest, most energy-needing organ we have. And some of Dale Bredesen's work has shown that if you eat near the time of going to sleep, what's happened is your blood flow, which prompts this lymphatic washing of your brain, is diverted down to your gut. And it isn't up in the brain to take this cleaning washing machine to full power. And so, the only, don't eat when you first get up. I mean, when we came out of our cave, we didn't say what's for breakfast. There was no breakfast. There wasn't a refrigerator. There wasn't a storage system. And we had to find breakfast. And quite frankly, it probably took us many hours to find breakfast. And so, so millennials, listen to your head brain millennial here. Get Genius Foods. It's the work of genius in the forms of Mac. There it is. Get this book. Enjoy it. it's an easy read, and even a blonde from New York can get it, like Max started the story with. I don't think he meant to imply that blondes were going to get dementia, but they don't.
No.
My wife's a blonde too. So. All right. So, Max, good luck with the book. I know it's going to be phenomenal. Bless you for all the research you've done, and can't wait to see you in person one of these days again soon.
Same, Dr. G. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
All right. And goodbye from Gundry MD, and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.
2002, 2003, there was some fascinating research coming out of UCLA, which focused on modulating nerve cells in the brain using dietary approaches. So these are animal studies, and they looked at the impact of, say, high fat and refined sugar diets, so sort of like junk food diets for mice, right, on these very important proteins in the brain that we know help to grow new nerve cells in the brain, new neurons. So there's two bits of the brain where you actually grow new brain cells over your life. And the really important bit for us anyway is the hippocampus. Two little structures right in the middle of your brain. And they play a very important role in learning and memory, so in your brain power. But they also seem to be important in mood regulation. And they seem to be the target of antidepressant drugs. So when you take antidepressants, the way in which they work seems to have a lot to do with making more of these proteins and making more brain cells in the hippocampus. And this group at UCLA was showing that you could really up and down regulate the amount of these neurotrophins, these proteins, by altering diet towards a healthy or an unhealthy component. So that was saying, okay, foods have a direct impact on this really key part of the brain that's important for mental health and brain power. And then around the same time had started this hypothesis that depression was very much a function of the immune system. So in the way that a dysregulated immune system, or what they call systemic inflammation, contributes to heart disease and to cancer and to other chronic diseases, there was starting to be pretty good evidence that this was also the case with depression, clinical depression. And of course, the things that influence this immune dysfunction, this low-level inflammation, are all the things that we know are not great for us. So, not getting enough sleep, not having enough vitamin D, not exercising, being fat, being overweight, because the fat tissue actually releases these pro-inflammatory little, molecules.
Right.
But diet, of course, is a major influence on the immune system. I'd always had a really strong interest in diet. I love food, but I also, I've also very much always felt that nutrition was really the foundation. It's like the petrol you put in your engine. If you put, rubbish in the engine, you're going to get rubbish out. But I couldn't quite believe when I started hanging around all these researchers and psychiatrists that no one was looking at diet in relation to mental health and in depression in particular. And to put it in context, depression is one of the leading contributors to the global burden of disease. So mental disorders and substance disorders in general account for the leading global burden of disability. So that means years of life lived not to their fullest because you are not able to fully engage with the community or workplace, those sorts of things. Like it has a major, major impact. And we're also now knowing, and this was true back, 10, 12 years ago, that our diets globally have changed really for the worse, like really, really profoundly. And obviously we see that reflected in the obesity epidemic, but it's also reflected in the huge tsunami of chronic disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome, cancer, all of these sorts of diseases related to unhealthy diet. So I wanted to put the two together, and I wanted to do a PhD, and I knew that the place that I was doing some work in had really good data on diet and also mental health. And when I first suggested it, there was a general Like, really? Isn't that sort of, hippie trippy, bit flaky, you're one of those naturopath types, blah, blah, blah. And I said, no, I think that's actually a really good reason that we should be looking at this more seriously. And they said, well, sure, if that's what you want to do. And I really think that part of what propelled me to work so hard over the last 7 years, it was just to show that I was right, to say I told you so.
Well, what amazing foresight to have had, such a progressive hypothesis. Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, couldn't it be said that for a long time the brain was considered immunologically privileged, in terms of its association with what was going on down below in the rest of the body, the separation via the blood-brain barrier and things like that. Now we know how intricately connected the brain and, these signals of inflammation, these pro-inflammatory cytokines, what have you, are to the brain. But that was when you had this idea, that was something that was pretty ahead of the curve.
It was. It wasn't, and there was a bit of sort of patronising head patting going on. Like silly woman wanting to look at diet. Diet doesn't have anything to do with the way you feel. Don't be silly. And so I went on and I did the first study to look at this relationship between overall diet quality and whether or not this large sample of women who are representative of the Australian population did or didn't have, at the time or in a history of major depressive disorder, anxiety disorders. So these were clinical disorders that we assessed. And of course, you take into account things like their socioeconomic status, education, age, those sorts of things, when you're looking at this. And what we found was really pretty clear relationships. And because it was the first study, it was published on the front cover of the American Journal of Psychiatry. So it had a pretty big impact. It was, I think, nominated the top research paper in psychiatry in 2010. It had a substantial impact. And on the basis of that, I was then able to go and propose working with many, many groups around the world who had data from these large cohort studies, these large observational studies. So they're not interventions. They don't try and change anything. They just collect data on people's diets, people's mental health, and a whole lot of other things. And I was able to go and build collaboration and interrogate data, in London, in adolescents in East London. We did a lot of work in Norway, in the very large MOBA study in Norway that looked at maternal diet and children's mental health. And from that, then I was able to very rapidly develop the evidence base to say that the quality of people's diets is most definitely related to the presence of or the risk for depression in particular. It doesn't seem to be explained by things like education, socioeconomic status, income. It doesn't seem to be explained by reverse causality. So that's, your mental health leading to you eating differently, even though we know that happens. Mm-hmm. This is more long-term patterns of eating that predisposed to depression or otherwise.
Interesting.
So it became really robust. So we did the first study in adults, we did the first studies in adolescents, and they were really important because half of all mental disorders start before the age of 14. So if you want to think about prevention, you need to go back. And then really importantly, we did the first study, and this is in 23,000 mothers and their children in Norway, to show that mothers' diets during pregnancy were related to the children's emotional health over the first few years of their life. And the children's diets were also really important. So they were separate contributions. Then in 2015, we showed for the first time in humans that diet quality was indeed related to the size of people's hippocampi. So this is this key region of the brain. And very obviously so, like it wasn't a tiny relationship, it was a big relationship. The healthier people's diets were, these were older people, the bigger their hippocampus, and the opposite was true. So that was really important. But of course, the final piece of the puzzle is the intervention study. This is when you actually take people who are depressed, you help them to change their diet. Ethics wouldn't allow us to make people's diets worse to see if that made them worse. That wouldn't work well. But we could help them to change it, to make it better, to see whether it would actually help their depression. And this is what we've just done. This is a study we've just published. It's gone ballistic all over the world. Last time I looked yesterday on the BMC Medicine website where it's been published, it's been accessed nearly 13,500 times in the 2 weeks since it's been published. So it's really obviously having an impact, which is wonderful. And now we can really start to say, okay, diet is important. We already knew that exercise was really helpful to treat depression, and there's good evidence that it's helpful to prevent it. Now we think we can say the same about diet.
So fascinating. You must be a very busy woman. So I'm all the more honored to.
I can't even. If I didn't have to sleep, it would make my life a lot easier.
Wow. But just to underscore, I mean, how important this research, this trial that you just published is, it's being called the world's first, trial, randomized control trial, to show that a dietary intervention can actually significantly improve symptoms of depression, to the point where, you actually had people go into remission, so that, in terms of the depression scales that you were using, they were actually no longer able to qualify as suffering from major depression. Is that accurate?
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Wow.
And, we were even surprised, even me, who really, I do believe my hypothesis, which I shouldn't as a scientist, but I do happen to think that nutrition is important for mental and brain health. I was even surprised by the size of the effect.
Wow.
It was pretty profound. At the same time, of course, you have to replicate these sorts of studies. It would be great to have a larger sample size next time, so you can maybe look at subgroup analysis. There's a lot of work still to be done, but I think it's a really, really important study to just say, yes, we really need to consider diet when we're looking at people with mental health problems, not just their physical health problems. But of course, the beauty of it is if you go to the doctor and you're depressed, which certainly in Australia, most people with depression end up in the GP, the general practice surgery, not with a psychiatrist or a psychologist first up. They should be able to say now, well, we can write you a referral to a dietitian. So as well as, or instead of, depending on the patient's preference and the doctor's view on how seriously ill they are, how about you go see a dietitian? And if they do that and they do improve their diet under the guidance of an expert, and it doesn't really need to be an expert, but for some people that's very helpful, it's also going to have a wonderful benefit for the obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, all of the other chronic illnesses that we know that depression increases the risk for, and that also increase the risk for depression. Wow.
Well, I mean, and especially in light of the latest reviews of efficacy when it comes to pharmacological antidepressant treatment, that, they, for people with mild to moderate depression are no more effective than a placebo. And yet they're not like safety belts, they have side effects that are significant. So, I mean, I think that this is for people that were really waiting for that kind of data. I mean, people in the functional medicine community have been talking about this stuff, but I mean, what's so important is to now have data on paper, which is so useful.
RCT evidence to be able to change policy and practice. And that was what my mission was to just say, look, I'm right. Listen to me.
Amazing.
Here are the data.
So can you talk to me a little bit about the dietary intervention? I mean, what were these people eating before, and what were the, what was the intervention? What did that look like?
So their diets were pretty blur. They had, it's probably important to contextualize this because it'd be the same in the States. According to our national surveys, only about less than 5% of Australian adults are getting the vegetables and legumes that are recommended as part of the Australian dietary guidelines.
Wow, 5%. So
the broader community is eating really badly, even though we have an abundance of wonderful, fresh, fantastic food in Australia, because of the influence of the food industry and the fact that these food products are They're addictive, they're ubiquitous, they're heavily marketed, they're super cheap, they're socially normalized. It means that people are eating crap instead of good stuff. And if you look at the data for children, it's even worse. Something like 0.5% of Australian children are eating according to the dietary guidelines, particularly around their vegetables and plant foods, which is the really key issue. So these people who are coming into the depression trial were no different. They had not very high levels of good food intake, and here we're talking about vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, so that's your beans, you know, chickpeas, lentils, that sort of thing. Raw nuts, really important, we think. Fish, lean red meat. This is the other thing. It wasn't a traditional Mediterranean diet, which doesn't have a lot of red meat. We've previously shown that people who have the recommended intake according to the dietary guidelines, which is about 3 or 4 small serves a week, like not huge, but, you know, just palm-sized serves a week, they were half as likely to have a clinical mental disorder. So we thought that was pretty interesting.
That is fascinating. Can I just underscore that for a second? So I'm aware of your previous research. You found that people that were eating less red meat were more at risk for depression, with the caveat being that, you know, the red meat consumed in Australia, which is where you are, is primarily grass-fed. That's
right. But what we found was a U-shaped relationship. So it wasn't just they were eating not enough. It was also those who were eating too much. So it was a U-shaped relationship, and the people in the recommended category were half as likely as either of those two categories, people in either of those two categories, to have a clinical depressive disorder, a clinical anxiety disorder, or even a bipolar disorder. The bipolar disorder data weren't published in that paper, but that's because we only had a small sample, but that's what we found. And then we adjusted for overall diet quality, because, of course, if you're eating a lot of red meat, you might also be eating a lot of vegetables and a lot of good stuff. You just might be eating a lot in general. Or you might also be eating a whole lot of processed meats and unhealthy foods. So we had to take that into account, and we still saw this very clear relationship. And what was notable was it's so consistent across the 3 different sorts of disorders: mood disorders, anxiety disorders, but also psychological symptoms. We saw a relationship as well. It's a bit more J-shaped. And the other key thing about this study was that we took out the 20 or so actual vegetarians, because there are quite a few studies saying that people who are vegetarians have worse mental health than people who are not vegetarians. But of course, it's a bit of a chicken and egg question with vegetarianism, because people who have, you know, maybe different diets, strict diets, sometimes they can be higher on what we call neuroticism, which is also related to risk for depression. So it's never been clear what's come first, one or the other. I was just talking to Captain Joe Hiblin yesterday, who's a big wig in the omega-3 fatty acids, seafood, brain health in the NIH. And he was telling me about some very, very interesting findings that they had in the ELSPAC study, which is the big British cohort study, looking at young people, vegetarianism and mental health. So there are more data coming out that suggests that there is a causal relationship. This hasn't been published yet, but I think that there's certainly going to be some new insights into this relationship published pretty soon.
I would love to learn more about that.
Yeah, me too. I'm really looking forward to reading the study when it comes out. But the key thing with our dietary intervention was basically we had dietitians who are used to working with people and motivating them and finding ways that they can manage to make those gradual tweaks and improvements to their diet, helping them to increase their intake of the plant foods that we know are good, olive oil, fish, and then the nuts, legumes, vegetables, fruits, the lean red meat. But one of the biggest changes, of course, was actually it was the reduction in the junk food. And that was probably a bigger change than anything, was that they came in having something like 30% of their diet as what we call extras foods, which is junk food. And that went right down. So this diet recommendation was really just about improving their overall diet quality. because all the research we've done has shown that both things, not getting enough of the good stuff and getting too much of the bad stuff, are both independently related to an increased risk or problem for psychiatric disorders, depression in particular. So that's what we did, and seemed to work.
That's amazing. Can you talk a little bit about, there were obviously a lot of things that changed in terms of your subjects' diets. I mean, some of the mechanisms you mentioned, obviously, an increase in the consumption of omega-3 fats, which grass-fed beef is particularly rich in, so is fish, things like that. Was olive oil a big staple in the diet that you recommended? Yep. I'm just curious about the various components and like how you would quantify the contribution of each in terms of the effect that you saw. You can't.
And I think that's sort of what we call the reductionist approach, where you try and break it down to particular foods and particular nutrients. We don't think at this point that it has a lot of utility, because whenever you eat, you're eating foods in very complex combinations, and the way they interact in the body is so complex that we can't even map it, with all the many, many different. So, for example, there's, obviously data to suggest that omega-3 fatty acids, which are found in seafood, are helpful or protective for mental health. And so is fish itself. But there's data to show that fish itself is protective way over and above the omega-3 fatty acids. There are other things in fish that we don't even know about that seem to be helpful. It's the same with things like red meat. Is it the zinc? Is it the iron? Is it the this? Is it the that? It's probably all of those things. They're probably all working on genetic pathways, gene expression pathways. They're working on the gut microbiota in ways that we can't even begin to understand. So breaking it down into individual foods, it's just
an exercise in futility, essentially.
Yeah, well, at this point, I do think, and this is something I'm putting in a big grant application for at the moment. There was a very interesting study last year from a group in Israel where they looked at people's postprandial glucose response to a standard meal. Mm-hmm. And so basically what they found was that if you get a bunch of people and you feed them exactly the same meal, their response to it in terms of the way their glucose goes up or down is completely different for each person. So it's saying that food doesn't act in the same way in every person, not even close. Right. But then what they did was they took all these medical data they had for these people and then added in the data from microbiome analyses that they'd taken from stool samples. And then they used these really cool statistical techniques, machine learning that's called. From that, they were able to develop an algorithm that they believed could predict for each individual person what would be the ideal dinner or meal to keep the postprandial glucose response as low as possible. So using that algorithm, they then tested that in an intervention, and they showed that it was true. So these are the steps towards this personalised nutrition that we're very interested in. Like what foods, what food combinations, what types of food are more useful for whom, under what conditions. And it's the same for nutrient supplementation trials as well.
Of course.
Not a hugely robust evidence base for supplements in mental disorders, apart from omega-3 fatty acids seem to be helpful for people who have high levels of inflammation. And that's not surprising, because inflammation basically depletes your omega-3 fatty acids from your cell membranes through oxidation processes. So replenishing is a good idea.
Right.
But we need to understand what are the background factors. The way everybody metabolizes nutrients is going to vary enormously based on their genetics and their microbiome. So if we can figure out tests that are relatively simple to work out who would benefit from what sort of an intervention, that's where I think we're going to be able to go in the next few years.
It's very exciting. I completely agree that everybody's different. There's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all dietary approach, but there are still some salient, guidelines that I think everybody can benefit from. I mean, because the alternative, waiting for such granular data to come out, could take decades. When you take genetics into account, when you take microbiome, gene sequencing, and things like that, so what based on your findings do you think could be broadly applicable? I mean, eat more, dark leafy greens, which we know are rich in prebiotic fiber. A focus on whole foods.
Michael Pollan's, which I just love that guy. I love what he said all the time. And we're running the first international meeting of the International Society for Nutritional Psychiatry Research that I founded.
Amazing.
In Washington in the middle of the year. And we want to get him as a guest opening plenary speaker, because I use his quote all the time, which is eat whole food. He just said eat food, but we take that to mean eat whole food, like not processed food.
Yeah.
Not too much, mostly plants.
It's that simple. And by the way, if he's not available, I will, wholeheartedly volunteer to open your show.
You're very welcome to come. It's going to be great.
Yeah, I would love to. And I think that's a great message to send, especially for people that are really lost when it comes to nutrition. But then, I think a lot of the people that are going to watch this video and are listening in via my podcast are interested in what's the next step from that, how they can better tweak their diets.
I've got a paper coming out very soon, and it's called Nutritional Psychiatry, Where to Next? And it sort of basically says, okay, well, this is what we know so far. This is what we've still got to find out. We're really just starting. There's a lot that we have to do. We're trying to get funding for the Food and Mood Centre so we can do all sorts of other research. It's very difficult to get research funding at the moment, which is true everywhere. But I also think, we're doing a lot of studies focused on the microbiome. And, whilst there's fantastic scientists all over the world that are drilling down and trying to understand what particular bacterial strain does what thing, where, and how you might manipulate it, and all of those sorts of things. I think that's great. I'm really glad you're doing that. We'll do a bit of that ourselves. But in the meantime, we already know that dietary fiber is key to a healthy gut. And not having a high-fat diet also seems to be very important. So it would be reducing dietary fats. That doesn't mean reduce them to almost nothing. You still need dietary fats, but it just means focus on the healthy ones and not have enormous quantities of them. Mm-hmm. But increase plant fiber. So vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts. It's those ones. They're the ones that your body needs. All different sorts too. Vegetables doesn't mean just potatoes Friday night or something. Vegetables, it's orange vegetables and red ones and green ones and, just diversity. And I would also say make your own fermented food at home. I make kombucha and kefir at home. It's super easy. It's super cheap. And it means that I can control the quality in a way, like I can choose the milk that I want. I use an A2 milk. There's things you can do, but it's super easy and cheap to do at home. And they're starting to really show that fermented foods have a wonderful impact on the gut. And we don't need to measure all the millions and millions of bugs that are in the fermented foods, although I'm sure people are doing that. You just need to make the fermented foods and eat and drink them.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there. Exercise, the relationship that we have with nature, the relationship that we have with temperature, the relationship that we have with light, the ever-present environmental toxins that your average human is exposed to on a daily basis.